This tutorial is sponsored by the 3D Coloring Book, a project specifically designed to help empower artists who are struggling with texturing in Substance Painter and to help show you that anyone can create beautiful pieces of art with just a little bit of practice and guidance. To instantly gain access to hundreds of pre-made professional level models and hours of high quality tutorials, click the link in the description and begin your journey today.
Hello guys, my name's Melissa, and today I'm going to show you how to make a stylized diorama in Unreal Engine, just like this one here. I'll be breaking down my workflow and focusing on how I achieve these sort of painterly textures. I find that a small-scale project like this is a great way to try new things or practice making scenes without getting overwhelmed with a fully populated environment. I'll be going over the 6 main programs I used for this, which are Maya, Zbrush, Substance Painter and Designer, and Photoshop, and of course, we're going to arrange the final scene in Unreal Engine 4. I learned a lot making this project, and I'm excited to share some methods that you can hopefully apply to your own environments. So the very first thing I do is just browse around on Artstation and Pinterest to gather some inspiration and reference. From here, I make a few mental notes of what I want to incorporate into my own piece. For example, you can see the softer color palette, the warm lighting, and painterly style. I recommend always adding in a few real-life photo references of the type of environment you want to create. It's just good practice to understand the difference between the real-life elements and the way these artists interpreted them in order to make your own stylized pieces. I always use PureRef for this step. It's an awesome free resource for this because you can just drag and drop photos from your web browser or your computer files into the program and just lay them out. You can crop and resize them, and it's super quick and easy. I set mine to the clear glass theme and set it to stay on top of all my other windows, and I usually just throw it onto my second monitor while I'm working. After that, I created a concept in Photoshop to just figure out the composition, the colors, and the lighting. This is all subject to change, but it's good to have a clear goal to work towards. I also list out all the assets I'm going to need to make. Just from the concept here, I'll know that I wanted to make 3 materials, one for the foliage, the ground, and then the extra props like the tree, the boat, and the rocks. This just comes from experience and depends on the project and how you want to organize things. Once I finished the concept art, I just add it onto my reference board. So when I was starting out in 3D environments and assets, I always had trouble visualizing how the final product would turn out because I wasn't that well versed in the programs yet, and I was still kind of figuring out the step-by-step process. A tip I have for this is to get some assets into whatever program you're going to be rendering in as early as possible. I'm using Unreal Engine 4, so I just threw a quick block out in the engine here, and I updated the models there as I went along. This way, I kind of always have a general picture of how the scene is looking all together, and I can make adjustments along the way. I just used Maya to quickly model out these bigger shapes first to get the composition going. I also used this step to work on the basic lighting. So go ahead and start out with a blank scene here and delete everything except your few lights and sky sphere. It's really important to nail down the main natural light source before adding anything else. I also added some super simple colors to my models to just get a better read with the lighting. I go ahead and set all my lights to movable and turn off the auto exposure so the lighting isn't changing at all while I move around the scene. I just adjusted the sky sphere to be pretty close to black. I like to keep things simple and just have a nice clean looking model in silhouette. I find a good viewing angle and drop a camera into the scene and go ahead and right click it and find Move Object to View. I usually open a second viewport and just lock the camera there so I can always see the full scene from that angle while I'm working. So you can click and find Pilot the Camera and then Transform Lock Actor Movement. So now it's going to be locked in this viewport here. You can also tweak the camera settings in here and you'll find a bunch of different settings that you can change, and you can see them in the viewport here. But I usually leave that for the end. I also just set the viewport to game mode by pressing G, and I usually move this onto my second monitor. So your two most important lights here are the directional light and the skylight. The directional is like your main sunlight, and then the skylight is your ambient sort of diffused lighting around the whole scene. So I've decided on the time of day and just set the directional light to a nice angle. I'm focusing on where the shadows are falling nicely and even bringing out some focal points. I decided to throw some shadows on this tree here and sort of bring the boat into the foreground more. I decided to also add in a secondary spotlight just to bring out the silhouette a bit more because it's a really dark background. As a rule of thumb, I turn off the shadows for everything except the main directional light to avoid any weird overlapping shadows. The skylight is going to bring up any of these dark shadows here, and you want to make sure you don't have any like grayish or blackish shadows because they'll make your scene look really muddy and unnatural. So just tint this to a nice color. I usually choose like a soft blue or yellowy color depending on whether it's a warm or cool palette. And go ahead and bring up the intensity a little bit until it looks nice. And this is pretty much everything I need for this stage, and I'll leave it here until I can get some more finished assets in. So now that we know the general placement of our objects, let's continue on with these props here. I only did some sculpting on the tree, the boat, and the rocks. I won't be getting into details of this step since there's a lot of tutorials out there on modeling, sculpting, and baking, but my general process is to create the basic shapes in Maya, move into Zbrush to sculpt some details, and then back into Maya to retopo and UV. So there are two methods I see covered most often for stylized art. These are hand painting your model from scratch in Photoshop, for example, or using a program like Substance Painter to generate your texture maps. I use a process that's sort of in between the two, and I think it's an efficient way to get that clean, stylized finish with a touch of the painterly look without having to spend hours painting your textures from scratch, especially if you don't already have a strong foundation in painting and 2D art. I start out in Substance Painter by baking down my high poly sculpt to the low poly models. This gives me a few useful maps such as the curvature and ambient occlusion. Right away, I create a fill layer and make sure the roughness is close to 1 and the metallic is 0. I drop in a base color like this soft brown here for the tree and the boat. Next, I'll add a new fill layer with a slightly darker and usually cooler tone, using the curvature map to mask out the sort of concave areas where I want this color to show up. Sometimes I'll try other generators like the baked stylized lighting to see if I like the effect. With stylized props, you're sort of able to use color and tone to push back certain areas and bring more attention to others, since we're kind of painting in our own basic lighting compared to the fully realistic workflow. After tweaking around with the layer modes and colors, we come up with a solid base to paint over. Now you can use any program for this step. I just continue in Substance Painter because it's easier than exporting to a new program. Plus, I like to paint directly on the model as compared to, say, Photoshop. However, Photoshop does offer a great selection of brushes and adjustment layers, and it's good if you're well versed in the program for painting already. To achieve a more painterly look, I recommend studying 2D art and traditional painting and seeing what methods you can transfer over to your 3D projects. One tip I have is to use each of your chosen colors throughout the scene as much as possible. So not just green for grass, not just brown for tree bark. Sprinkle in some color variation where you can to simulate that the light is bouncing around the scene. Since there's going to be a lot of foliage around here, I know that I want to add in some hints of green and yellow to the tree and the boat textures. For a mossy overlay, I added a layer of green using the ambient occlusion generator, and then paint into these areas where I want to fill in some of the crevices here. Using a paint layer, I also just start adding in some other colors and trying to break up this base texture to make it more messy and interesting. This is a subtle effect, so make sure it doesn't go too far from your chosen color palette and blends in nicely. Next, I'll show you my process for making foliage. I just started again in Maya by modeling some simple shapes into clusters of grass, leaves, and flowers. I just use Maya because I'm most comfortable with it, but you could use Zbrush as well. For this style, I wanted some very smooth, simple shapes, and I used the soft select tool a lot rather than sculpting. The poly count doesn't really matter for this step, so I did a smooth function on most of these. A tip I have for making organic modular pieces is to create two variations. This larger piece here, which will be duplicated many times, and a small separate piece, just like a little leaf cluster or a single lily pad. You can add these in whenever it's needed to just break up the pattern and add some variation to make it look more natural. Of course, for this small diorama, we aren't going to make too many duplicates, but for full-blown environments, this is especially useful. And finally, I just created a square plane underneath these as a guide and arranged everything inside the boundaries. I'm working in the top view mostly at this step to see the most accurate result. Keep them as tidy and close together as possible. You can see from the side view that mine are sticking out a bit, but I'll show you how to adjust for that later. You can see that the models are different colors. This gives Substance Designer a way to separate the models into different groups. For example, I wanted these flowers to be their own color, so I need to create a node that will only affect these models. The color of the models doesn't really matter, but they need to be different enough for the program to recognize them. Finally, you'll need to export two FBX files, one of just the plane and one of all the high poly foliage. Now let's bring these into Substance Designer. I'm still fairly new to Designer, so I kept this step very basic. It's the same exact idea as when we were texturing our props, just with a different program. So we're going to create a base using the models we just made and then paint over it. This is what my finished maps look like. Just like before, I used the ambient occlusion maps to color these in. I'll show you how I set this up. So just open up a new project using the PBR metallic roughness template. You'll want to create a new output right away and set it up to show the opacity. Again, make sure the roughness is high and the metallic is 0, so a black value. You can use the actual ambient occlusion node, but I found it to be a little overpowering and not really necessary because it creates an extra map that you'll have to export. So I just focused on the base color and the normals. Right-click on your new substance and find Link 3D Mesh. This will be your FBX file with just a plane in it. Once you import it, it will show up under Resources. If you don't see it in the viewport, just right-click on your foliage and click View Outputs in 3D View. Now with the file we just imported, let's find Bake Model Information, this is where our high poly models are going to come in. So there's a lot going on in this menu, but I pretty much left everything at the default settings. Go in and find your high poly model. So mine is foliage high poly. This menu down here allows us to manually choose whatever maps we want to get out of our sculpts. So click Add Baker. I use the ambient occlusion from mesh, curvature from mesh, normal from mesh, opacity from mesh, and then this is where you would also get your color maps. You can also set the output folder and name. The only other setting we need to adjust is the frontal and rear value. Remember earlier that my model was sticking out pretty far above the plane I created. This means Substance Designer might miss some bits of the high poly models. So I go ahead and set the frontal value all the way to 1. This might take a bit of trial and error, so just mess with these two values. Go ahead and start the render, and you can see our different maps here. So let's go ahead and drop in our normals and plug it in. To set up the opacity, plug in your map and right-click the output node and click View in 3D View. For the colors, I sometimes use the ambient occlusion map because it has some nice smooth shadows. The main tool we're going to be using is the gradient map node. This allows me to control the color variation for the highlights, midtones, and shadows. For instance, if I want to add some cool tone shadows, just drop a blue shade in here and adjust it until it looks good. If you want to use the normal map instead, you can make a curvature smooth node, and this will turn it into a grayscale map. You can see this gives me some more detailed information. You can even multiply these two together using blend nodes. So you would just create a blend node, plug in your colors to the background since we want to add the ambient occlusion map on top, and set it to multiply. And you can see that adds a little more depth to these shadows. To use the color maps that we made, drag your map onto the scene and create a node called Color to Mask. There's an eyedropper here that you can use to pick the color of the object you wanted to select. So I chose the purple color and then masked out these flowers. I used the same curvature smooth node we created and make a new gradient map up here with some different colors. Now we're going to apply this mask to the colors we just made with a blend node. So plug the colors into the foreground and the map into the opacity here, and you can see the result. Now let's add that onto our color map by making another blend node. So this is our background, this is our foreground, and there you go. So that's pretty much all I did. Just layering these on top of each other to create the final result. I also used a slope blur grayscale node to add some just subtle imperfections to the edges of the leaves. but it didn't really have a huge effect. I ended up not using the curvature map because these are all smooth, organic surfaces, but it would be useful for something with more harsh edges, such as rocks. Once you're happy with it, just click on your substance and find Export Outputs as Bitmaps. Again, I only needed the base color, normals, and opacity. Then I moved into Maya to create our low poly foliage assets. You can see what they all looked like here. So I start with a plane with no subdivisions and just scale it up a bit. I create a material using the base color and opacity maps we just made, and go ahead and apply them to this plane so we can see what we're doing here. Then I just use the hand cut tool from the modeling toolkit to cut out each of the pieces. Always try to keep things simple and optimized. Once you cut out an object, hide everything else and then move it to the origin to set it up. For the grass cards, I just duplicate this plane and make it perpendicular shape so it looks more three-dimensional from different angles. It looks a bit odd here, but I'll show you how to set up this material correctly in Unreal. So to set that up, just change the foliage material to be two-sided. Just plug in the base color map to the subsurface color for now. That will make your material look more translucent and allow a bit of light to shine through. After that, all my foliage is ready to arrange around in the scene. Finally, I created a quick texture for the ground in Photoshop. Since I have my other textures finished already, I can use them for reference for hand painting the grass texture to match. I really just went in and painted the grass with some messy brushes and continually used the offset feature to help me paint over the harsh edges until it could tile seamlessly. The main challenge I faced here was consistency and bringing the textures together, since the ground texture is the only texture that was fully hand painted. So we're getting into the final stages here. This is what my scene looked like after I set up all the finished assets and materials. All I did was create a material for each of the textures I've made and plug in the base color and normal maps, and then just set the roughness again to very close to 1. Once it looks pretty cohesive, I start adding more lighting and effects on top of this to bring it to the next level. Using small point lights with flattering colors can add a lot of nice smooth color variation, especially to repeated models so they don't look too flat and boring. It can also help bring attention to certain areas and create focal points that lead the eye around your piece. You can see in the foliage here, without the lighting it looks quite flat and the repeated texture is much more obvious. Just make sure you aren't straying too far from the color palette you've established. You can also see that the back side of the leaves here are a warmer yellowy color, where the sunlight is sort of coming in through the trees. There are a few ways to achieve this, but I'll show you what I did. So here in the foliage texture, I created a node called Hue Shift, and just plug it into the base color. Adjust this value ever so slightly to be a warmer color, and then plug that into the subsurface color. So any part of the model that you get to see some light coming through is going to be a warmer version of the texture we created. I also added a yellowish point light towards the middle of the canopy here, and you can see it made a huge difference in the look of my leaves. I'll also show you a couple of super basic effects you can add to your scene, just to add some interest and movement. First of all, getting the foliage to move helps a lot. So go to your foliage texture and add in a simple grass wind node, and just play around with the values here until it's to your liking. Unreal Engine also comes with a starter content pack that includes basic dust particles. You can just drop this into your scene and again just play around with the settings here, and this works for most scenes. Finally, adding in a post-processing volume can be a huge help in bringing your final scene together and making tweaks. You can add things like bloom, depth of field, color grading, the highlights and shadows, and this really makes everything pop more and just look more cinematic. I also dropped in some atmospheric fog. It's not doing a whole lot for this scene since it's so small, but it's helpful for larger scenes. I try to be subtle with these since they can easily be overdone though. You'll find that some settings are really sensitive and even small value shifts make a big difference. And we're here at the final product. I hope this tutorial was helpful, and you can always find me on Artstation if you have any additional questions. Thank you for watching!